Missed an episode of your favorite podcast? Choose from over a decade of content in our archives, not just the latest episode. All free at GCNlive.com.
This is your call to action. Get prepared, America. Economy, survival, energy, disasters. This is USAPrepares.com. Informative radio, educational radio. Interact now by emailing instructor@USAPrepares.com or text at 434-390-7953. Class, please take your seats. Now, your instructor, Vincent Finelli.
Everyone all set? Cocked, locked. Here we go. Your dial's set correctly to USA Prepares. We're delighted you're in class with us today. There's just three of us in the studio, me and a couple of colts. And we're broadcasting 2 hours from high atop the Missouri Ozark Mountains. John is engineering the broadcast at GCN. I'm Vincent Finelli. Today, hour number 1, generators. I'd like to share with you my experiences with generators, how they work, how to connect them to your house safely, efficiently, in a frugal manner. Hour number 2, an American hero. No kidding. An activist. Senior USA Prepares instructor. He's 88 years old. He stared down the full force of the United States government. His name is Dr. Adam Fortunate Eagle. He lives on a reservation in Fallon, Nevada. He is the principal occupier, the organizer of the Alcatraz occupation, when a band of Native Americans occupied Alcatraz to prevent the United States government from selling it to private corporations. No kidding. He's the real deal. And we're going to talk about the atrocities, the genocide, committed by the United States government against the original Americans, the Native Americans, also known as the American Indians. That's hour number 2. So let's get started with generators. So yesterday, Mrs. Finelli came up to me and she said, "So what are you going to talk about tomorrow?" "I'm going to talk about generators." "Oh, okay. Hey, do you have any questions?" She said, Yes. So I'm at home with the children. This is a scenario that just came to her in her mind. I'm at home with the children, and my husband is gone, and I don't know when he's going to return because of the storm. The storm could delay his return. How easy is it to start the generator? I said, great. That's exactly what I'm going to talk about. And it will be easy to start the generator because the whole family will have learned how it works, and they will have practiced everything they need just for that scenario that you have mentioned, that question. So here we go. Last time we talked about generators in part 1, we talked about the size of generators, small portable generators, mid-sized generators, large generators, and we talked about the difference between rated watts and surge or maximum watts. We talked about fuel, we talked about gasoline and propane and diesel, and now we're going to talk about whole house generators and connecting those generators to your house. Now, you can have a whole house generator that is still portable. Okay? It can still be one that you buy at the big box stores. You don't have to have some company come in with a crane and lower a large generator onto a concrete pad that was prepared for it. Now, you can wire your whole house yourself, in my opinion, if you know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing, you need to get a book. And a really good book on electricity is by Black & Decker. Get a complete guide to electricity, home wiring. Well, here's how it goes. A whole house generator can provide electricity for your whole house, but it generally cannot provide enough electricity to run all the things that you want to run when you want to run them. So you're going to have to scale down. So let me give you an example. So let's say you have an older home and the wiring is from the 1960s. It probably has a 100 amp breaker panel. 100 amps at 240 volts is what you would have. And what does that equal in horsepower? Well, let's say you go to the store and you say, I want to buy a generator, and they say, well, it's, 8 horsepower. Well, What is 100 amp service at 240 volts if you relate that to horsepower or convert it to horsepower? 32. It's 32 horsepower. Now, if you have a 1980s and newer service, breaker service in your breaker panel in your house, it's probably about 200 amps. 200 amps at 240 volts would equal 64 horsepower. So if you wanted to provide enough electricity to maximize the rating of your electrical service panel at 200 amps, you would need a 64 horsepower generator. It's huge. Well, that tells you that you can't run your whole 100 or 200 amp service on 8 horsepower. So if you go to the big box store and you look at the generators, you'll see 8 horsepower, 11 horsepower, so forth. So what you're really going to have to do is scale down. You're going to have to scale down what you want to power simultaneously and get that down to the minimum. And why? The reason that you don't want to overbuy a generator, one that's too big, is because you have to feed it. So, for example, an 8 horsepower generator will use a lot less fuel than an 11 horsepower generator, because the generators that we're talking about, the conventional generators, run at wide open throttle, kind of like that lawnmower you have. In order to produce electricity 240 volts and 120 volts at 60 cycles per second or 60 hertz, a conventional generator needs to run at 3,600 RPM, 3,600 RPM. Now think about that on your automobile. If you have a tachometer, 3,600 RPM is pretty high. Now car engines and small truck engines can run at 5,000 RPM, wide open throttle. Well, wide open throttle on an air-cooled engine is about 3,600 RPM. So it's running wide open throttle. So you don't want to run wide open throttle a bigger engine than you need. Okay. We have a 5,000 watt generator. And believe it or not, this 5,000 watt generator, it's a diesel, has enough generating capacity to run our farm, if we're careful. Okay? That doesn't mean that we can run everything we want when we want, and we've prepared our home for this. So we have eliminated the things that draw a lot of current, like an electric stove. We don't have one. We do not have an electric stove. We have a propane stove, propane burners, propane oven. Now, of course, we have a microwave oven, but that is really, the principal use for that is to be a range hood, because a range hood was more expensive than a microwave oven range hood. And so we thought, okay, and if we ever need a microwave oven, we've got one. All right, so how do you wire a generator to your house? Well, some people take one of those orange extension cords, put the generator outside, and run that orange extension cord into the house. Now, in the winter, you can have an air leak, and that's all right. A little air leak is okay. But if it's freezing cold and you don't have any heat, it's not so good. And you need to have, if you do that, you need to have the right size extension cord. Extension cords typically come in a very light gauge, 18 AWG, American wire gauge, which is thin wire. And as the numbers get smaller, the wire size gets thicker. As the wire size gets thicker, you can handle more and more current. So they start at 18 gauge, which is a very, very light duty extension cord, for Christmas lights. That's about it. Next would be 16 gauge. Next would be 14 gauge. Then 12. And then a real heavy extension cord, really, really heavy, 10 gauge. As the gauge gets smaller, meaning the wire gets thicker, the extension cords get heavier, much heavier, but they can carry more current. Typically, you're going to probably want to use 14 and 12 gauge extension cords if you're going to hook up your generator to extension cords. But the problem with that is, how do you hook up your well? Because most well pumps are 240 volts. And typically, they are hardwired into your breaker box or your breaker panel. So with this extension cord scenario, you might be able to run one to your refrigerator. You might be able to run an extension cord for some lighting, in the kitchen. And most people in the city are most concerned about television. So you can probably run one at your television on an extension cord. That's not going to be a problem. But what is going to be a problem is heating, because most heating systems are hardwired. and they're 240 volts most of the time. So if you have a heat pump, forget it. You're not going to be able to run your heat pump on an extension cord. You're not going to be able to run your electric clothes dryer on an extension cord, nor your well pump, nor your stove. But you can run a microwave oven, and you can run a small portable heater, but they use a lot of electricity, which means that you're going to have a generator that can stand it. Typically, a portable electric heater will consume around between 15 and 1800 watts, and that's the maximum that you're going to be able to carry through one of these orange extension cords. Now, here's a rule of thumb. You should test out all of these devices that you want to power before the storm, like this weekend, and feel those extension cords and see if they get warm, trying to run the devices that you want to run. If they get warm, you're overloading that extension cord. Now, one of the problems that I found with extension cords is the ends on them are typically molded. So you have an orange extension cord, an orange plug, and an orange receptacle. The male end is not the problem. The female end is, because they become weak and loose, and the device that you want to plug into the extension cord doesn't usually fit snugly. And you have resistance there, and you get heat there, and then you start to overload the capacity of that extension cord at that point because of the heat, and you can actually have a fire. So I don't like those kinds of extension cords with those flexible molded ends, but there aren't many options unless you want to put your own end on. We'll come right back and talk more about this. Yeah, we're talking about generators, and I was mentioning those orange extension cords with the flexible molded ends on them. And what I do is I cut off the female end, and I buy a much better replacement end, which is much harder plastic that's not so pliable and flexible. And you can get them for $5 or $6 or $7, but you've got to know what you're doing to put one on well, so that you don't have so you don't increase the resistance and cause it to overheat. All right, so here's a book that I think is quite outstanding. I've got it in my hands. This is the book that I used to wire our house. Pretty much everything you're going to need to know is in this book about home wiring. I think it's the finest book on home wiring there is. It's made by Black & Decker. It's called The Complete Guide to Home Wiring. The Complete Guide to Home Wiring. And when I find them used on the internet, I buy them and have them sent to our instructors and our friends who I think can use them. They're excellent. The second best book, I believe, is The Ultimate Guide to Wiring, Complete Home Projects. It's made by Creative Homeowner, Ultimate Guide to Wiring. And both of the books are excellent. If you can only get one, my choice is the Black & Decker book. Okay, back to generators. So let's say you've decided that you really don't want to mess around with these extension cords because it's really not the best way to go. So you can wire in what's called a transfer switch. And a transfer switch is an electrical switch device that's installed right near your existing electrical circuit breaker panel in your home. And it connects those circuits that you need in your panel to your generator. So instead of extension cords, you just throw the switch. Well, in my case, what I did was I bought a transfer switch, and it has 3 positions. It's a big box. It's probably 30 inches tall, maybe 16, 15 inches wide. And it's heavy. It has a big lever on the side, kind of like a slot machine. Not quite as long as a slot machine, but it's got this lever, and you grab it with your hand. And it has 3 positions: up, center, and down. And in our case, up means the grid. Up is the normal position when we had our house totally tied to the grid. Okay? Up is grid. The center position is off, meaning the grid is disconnected. And down is the generator is connected. So you can either have the grid connected, you can have your wiring system disconnected from the grid, or you can have it connected to the generator. but you can't have it connected to the grid and the generator at the same time. And that's the purpose of this switch. Okay? And the reason for that is if the power goes out and if you didn't have a transfer switch and you just had your generator connected to your home wiring system and it wasn't disconnected from the grid, everything would be fine except for a couple situations. One is when the power comes back on, the grid would be so powerful that it would blow up your generator. They'd burn it up. Two, if your linemen are trying to repair the wiring that has been taken down by a storm, for example, or a big tree, and you are powering your house through your generator and the grid is connected to it, you're also sending your electricity down the power poles and on the grid. And you can electrocute one of those linemen and kill him. So you need a transfer switch, in my opinion. So this transfer switch is really required by the National Electric Code for any connection of power to the home. Now, I don't necessarily like following rules and regulations, but the National Electric Code, I think, is outstanding. And our house actually exceeds the National Electric Code. And you can, if you want to know what that is, you can buy the book, the National Electric Code. So a transfer switch is the only safe way that I know of to connect a generator to your home. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we come back. And I'll tell you what one costs. They're pretty expensive. We'll be right back. So the transfer switch that I purchased for our farm about 13 years ago was about $300. I just couldn't get over how much it was for this box with a few small parts in it. It seemed outrageous to me. Well, I just looked up the price of that exact one. Today is $462.40. That's the lowest price I can find it for. So they're pretty darn expensive if you want to switch 200 amps. Now, 100 amp switch is a little less expensive. And what this really means is this switch sits between the grid and your house wiring, and you connect your generator to it. So you either have the grid running in the normal operation, or you have the generator running. Pick one, and you just throw the switch. So it's really very, very convenient. And because of that, because of this design, you're using your house wiring. Your house wiring is already in place. Already connected are all those devices that you want to power. Your lighting is already there. Okay? And if you have a 240-volt generator, it will, depending on the kind of heating you have, if you have a heat pump, it's not going to typically run your heat pump, but it will run the circulator system. It won't run your electric hot water heater either, but it will run some of your small appliances. So that's a great way to have electricity to your whole house by simply throwing the switch. So you're going to have to read about this. Now, maybe you're up to doing it through your skills. Maybe you need to learn some more skills. Maybe you need to have a friend help you. But you need to do it right, because you're going to be dealing with 240 volts, and you can electrocute yourself. So you really need to know what you're doing. And you may need to have the electric company remove your meter while you install this, so that you disconnect the grid from your house wiring. Some systems have circuit breakers. Ours does. So if I want to just go out to the meter and shut off the main breaker at the meter base, I can do that. But not all systems have that feature. The older ones don't. Okay, so what this does, this transfer switch lets you use a smaller or less expensive generator to meet your power needs, because you're running it more efficiently with less effort, because you're using your existing home wiring. And there are automatic transfer switches. Now, I'm not even going to talk about them because it makes no sense to me to get one. There are many reasons why. One reason is I'm concerned about electromagnetic pulses. And if you have an automatic generator transfer switch, you're going to have a processor, a microprocessor, and some sophisticated electronic controls and relays and things that the circuitry may be susceptible to an EMP. Why? Because it's wired to an antenna. What's the antenna? Well, that would be your house wiring in the grid. Okay, so if there is an EMP, it can destroy your automatic transfer switch. So I'm only interested in a manual one. So let's strip down to minimum essential. So I was looking on the internet last night, and I saw one that was kind of neat. Square D is a company that makes electrical components, receptacles, switches, breaker panels, circuit breakers, and a lot more. Well, they've got a 60 amp, 120, 240 volt generator panel. It's called the generator panel. It sells at Home Depot, and I'm not necessarily recommending Home Depot, but I'm just saying that that's where you can get one, $129. Now it has, it's 60 amps, and it has 4 spaces for circuit panels, circuit breakers. So you can have 4 circuits connected to this box. So what you do is you wire this into your existing house wiring. You go from your existing breaker panel to this next breaker panel, which is a generator panel, and you put in a 60 amp breaker in your existing panel. You run SE type wiring, which is service interest type wiring, from one panel to the next, your main panel to this generator panel, and you can run 60 amps worth of devices off it. And what you do is, if you think your refrigerator is important, you now connect your refrigerator to this new panel. You connect your lighting to this new panel. And if you have a well pump and you want to connect that, you connect that. So what happens is, all of your devices that you want to run off the 60 amp panel are connected to it. And when the power fails, you go to this panel. There's a toggle switch that will switch between generator and grid, and you flip it to generator. You run your generator and power your devices. That's a great way to go for $129 plus, the labor of wiring it in, plus a small amount of a few feet of SE type cable. So that's a transfer switch, and I think it's kind of a great way to go, and that's why we have one. And ours is manual. It's not something that you don't have to learn about. You're going to have to actually learn how it works. Now, can you run a well pump on a generator? I already mentioned that, and the answer is yes. Yes. So if you have a well pump that has a depth of 100 feet or so or more, they're typically wired for 240 volts. A 120 volt AC only generator will not be able to power that well pump. So when you buy your generator, you need to make sure that the generator that you're going to buy will power the devices that you want. So find out if you have a well, find out if it's a 240 volt well pump or not. And you can usually tell by going to your breaker panel, and you find the breaker that is designated for your well pump, and if it has 2 poles, it's 240 volts. If it would be typically double the size of a single pole breaker. Now, a single pole would be 120 volts. So you can look at your breaker panel, and you should do that anyway. So tonight's homework is the weekend's homework is to go to your breaker panel and look at every single circuit breaker and find out if you know where they all go. Have they been identified? If they have not been identified, you need to identify them. Okay? So that usually takes 2 people. So one person switches on and off breakers, another person says, "Oh, lights went off in the kitchen. Oh, the outlets went off in the kitchen. Well, the family room lights went off. The outlets don't work in the family room," those kinds of things. So that's how you find out. And you mark them. You mark what each breaker does, because during a power outage is not the time to try to figure that out. Okay. So I mentioned generators and how long they last or how long they don't last. A conventional generator, gasoline fueled, in the 5,000 watt range, are typically built for temporary use. Use them once every few years. So if you used one for 24 hours a day, it would require an oil change every day, and they would last about a month. So you'd need a couple cases of oil. You'd need a huge amount of gasoline, because they typically burn about 1 gallon of gasoline per hour. So keep that in mind. So if you don't use your generator more than once a year, if you leave fuel in the tank, you're likely to gum up and varnish and plug up the carburetor, and it won't run. And that is 100% of the cases that I've seen. People have generators, they start them up, they go, "Wow, that's really neat, it works great," and then they just leave the gasoline in the tank. And then the next time they go to use the generator, they don't run because the carburetor has been gummed up by the volatilization of the fuel, turning the fuel into varnish. So if you're going to use your generator, you use it, and when you're done using it, you drain the gas tank and you run the generator out of fuel until the generator quits from running out of fuel. Then you can store it. All right, let's talk about inverters. I'm not talking about a generator inverter. I'm talking about a generator versus an inverter. We have a 2,500 watt inverter here at our farm. And what happens is an inverter can convert 12 volts, like a common automotive battery, to 120 volts DC. AC. So it converts direct current to alternating current. It will convert a 12 volt car or light truck battery to power some 120 volt devices. We found some on eBay a few days ago. They're about $260 for a decent brand 5,000 watt peak. But that's really a wish. You're really not going to get 5,000 watts out of it. You might get 2,500 watts out of it. And what can you power with it? Well, I've tested our refrigerator. We can power our refrigerator with it. You can connect it to your car engine or your car battery, powered by the charging of your car batteries by your car engine. And why is that important? Well, on average, you'll probably have about half a tank of fuel in your car at any point in time. That's halfway between empty and full. So if you have a half a tank of fuel and you're draining your car battery, you can recharge your car battery with your car engine and run this almost silent inverter. This inverter is about the size of a shoebox, and it has heavy cables, kind of like car jumper cables. That's about the size of cable you're going to need. And you can actually hook up a car a jumper cable to the inverter for a quick connection, and then you can run an extension cord into your house. And this is kind of a temporary situation as well. So we use it on our farm for emergency lighting in remote areas. So let's say we go into the barn and we need to see and it's dark. Well, we can take an inverter with us, hook it up to the tractor battery, or if we take the Jeep, we can hook it up to our old Jeep and run some temporary lighting. Now, these are silent. These inverters are absolutely silent. I mean, just the whisper of a fan. How loud? About the same noise as your computer fan. Here's another thought. What about a uninterruptible power system for your computer? Can you use that in an emergency? The answer is absolutely. I bought a 1,500 watt uninterruptible power system by a company called APC, American Power Conversion. I believe they're the best in the business. And it had a dead battery. I bought it for about $50, shipping included, no tax. $50. 1,500 watts. I am broadcasting with that UPS right now. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how this works. And you can literally do what I did and connect an uninterruptible power source to your whole house. Pretty cool. We'll be right back. So I think this is a pretty neat idea. I don't know of anyone else who has experimented with this, so I can't direct you to go find it on YouTube, or because I don't think it's there. But here's what I did. I bought a used uninterruptible power system, 1,500 watts by APC. As I mentioned, I believe the best in the business. And it didn't have a battery. So that was $50 shipped. And then I bought a brand new battery, an 18 ampere hour battery, 12 volts, for about $50 shipped. So the cost for the UPS is $100. Then I bought a used 12 volt alarm system power supply for about $20 on the internet, shipped. So now I have about $120 in the system. So here's what I did. I plugged the UPS into an outlet, and what it does is it provides power continuously, and if the power fails, it will ride out a short power interruption, keep the computers running. Right this minute, all the computers in the studio are running on this system. And what I did in the kitchen a couple of years ago was I made what's called picture rail. Picture rail is molding that's about 10 to 18 inches from the ceiling. And it goes around the perimeter, and I installed LED strip lighting on the top of the picture rail, pointing up. And then I wired that LED strip around the kitchen to a switch, a standard wall switch that I added. This is in a separate box. I did not add this into the existing 120 volt switches that we have in the kitchen. It's a separate box, separate switch, and I used alarm wire to wire the LED lighting that's attached to the picture rail. And then I connected the switch to the power supply, the 12 volt power supply that's connected to the UPS. So when the power fails, I just flip a switch. It's good to go. Now, how long does this last? Well, a 12 volt lead acid battery that are in really, really good condition are 13.2 volts. So 18 ampere hours at 13.2 volts is 238 watts. You just multiply volts times amps and you get watts. At 20 watts of power consumption, the light runtime is about, these LEDs, about 12 hours. So if we're really conservative, we'll say it'll run 8 hours on this small uninterruptible power system that we have already hooked up. Now, what I did that I think is the most exciting part of this is I wired many outlets in our house to this UPS. I use standard Romex 14 gauge wire. So, for example, let's say you have one of these things in your garage, a UPS. So from the garage, you run to, let's say, the kitchen. And then you go from the kitchen to the bedroom. And in our case, we have 4 or 5 outlets throughout the house that are orange in color. And I picked orange ones so that I would differentiate. If someone wants to plug something in, they go, wait a minute, this is an orange outlet. Something different about this. Maybe I better find out why this is different. So the orange ones are for the UPS. And it works great. Now ours, of course, is now plugged into an off-grid system. And the off-grid system will not keep the computers running during problems with the off-grid system. But the UPS will. And the UPS is plugged into the off-grid system. But you can plug your UPS into the grid. And you can have 8 hours of lights if you do it the way I recommend it. And it absolutely works. And we've been doing this for 20 years. Not at this house, but even in Virginia we had a UPS. Had a small one and a small fluorescent light in one room, and it ran all night. So yes, you can. You can use an uninterruptible power system as a temporary way of generating enough electricity. Well, you're not generating, you're just taking off the battery. But it works. Now, let's say you really want to have a longer runtime. Well, if you have a 12-volt UPS, you can hook it up to a car battery. Or if it's a 24-volt UPS, you can hook it up to 2 car batteries. But I don't recommend you charge them from the UPS because after about 2 years, the batteries tend to explode. But temporarily, if you're not going to charge them by the UPS, you charge them with a small charger, disconnected from the UPS, they work great. So I think that's worth a thought. Looks like we'll do part 3 next week. Everyone all set? Cocked? Locked? Hour number 2 of USA Prepares. This hour is a special hour. We're broadcasting with a dear friend, a true hero, an activist who faced down the United States government. His name is Dr. Adam Fortunate Eagle. He's Chippewa. Welcome, Dr. Adam Fortunate Eagle.
Bonjour, Nate. I'm sorry. I spoke to you in our native tongue. Now I have to speak a foreign language to communicate with you.
Okay. I love it. You know, you are one of the brightest men I know, and the most determined. And we're going to talk during this hour about what you and your band of tribes did in Alcatraz. And also we're going to talk about the genocide committed by the United States government over the decades and centuries. Why don't we start with how we met? Do you want me to describe how we met, or would you like to do that?
No, you go ahead.
Okay.
My memory gets somewhat foggy as the years go by, and
Okay.
I can't even remember. All I know is recall specifically is that I went to Sioux Falls, South Dakota for a writers' conference, and after the conference was over, I started to return to Nevada, and somewhere along the line, I met this strange guy in an airport, and we struck up a conversation, and that's how we end up now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you want to fill in the details?
Sure. We met at this airport, and I saw the poster boy for we'll use our terms, an American Indian, absolutely the poster boy. And if you want to see what Dr. Adam Fortunate Eagle looks like, you can type that into your favorite search engine, and you will see him. And you'll see that he is the poster boy. And I asked him, I walked up to him and I said, "Are you a Native American?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "I'm really sorry for everything that we white men have done." And he smiled, and we hit it off from then on. And we arranged our seats so that we could sit together on the airplane, and we spent a couple hours chatting. And then Dr. Adam Fortunate Eagle has been on the air with me several times over the years, and we've talked about Native American events that have happened. And one of these events was the occupation of Alcatraz, 1969 to 1971. And Dr. Adam Fortunate Eagle was the principal organizer of the occupation of Alcatraz by Indians of all tribes. Is that correct?
I stand guilty as charged.
Well, you are, according to the internet, you're 89 years old, but you are 88 at this moment. Is that correct?
88. I'll be 89 and on July. Okay. Well, that's just a couple of months away. Mm-hmm. I can't believe I've survived that long. You know, people talk to me about, the health food. You got to have this health food, or you got to have that kind of drinks and everything. But I eat the wrong food, I drink the wrong drinks. But I'm 88 years old, and I've outlived all my enemies.
Isn't that fascinating? You've outlived all your enemies.
Humor is an important thing, and that's what, as the principal organizer of the Indian occupation of Alcatraz, I first wrote a proclamation of Indians of all tribes, which uses satire and humor as a weapon. And that proclamation is being studied in colleges and universities today, and even McGraw-Hill is publishing that in a big book for higher education. So the proclamation I wrote is going to be a historic item, and I have the original ones in my archives here.
Now, you live on a reservation in Fallon, Nevada. Is that correct?
That's right. It's a little reservation. It's got its own sad story of history of how we ended up with only 6,500 acres when our original reservation here was 35,000 acres. The government reneged on their commitment to our tribe back in 1906. So this kind of story goes on and on, unfortunately.
You know, one of the things that I was thinking about this morning before the broadcast is the phrase, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help," or "you can trust us."
Yeah. Well, we, after all these years of dealing with the government and over 300 treaties, by the way, the Indians never wrote those treaties. It was always white guys, lawyers, and they wrote it in their language, and our people didn't understand the full extent of those treaties and how we worked compelled to give away millions and millions of acres of lands and our natural resources.
I never told you this, but I had an expo in a city called Lebanon, Missouri. And we have a friend who's one of our instructors on the air, as you are an instructor. And he is the head of Nemenha, a band of Indian tribes. And I have been adopted into this band. And I asked him if he would consecrate the event at the city location. It was a city-owned location, a convention hall, for the consecrated as sacred ground during the 2.5, 3 days of our expo. And a couple cops showed up, and I said, look, you guys, you can't be here in uniform. You can't be representing the U.S. or the city government, because we are consecrating the grounds at 6 o'clock tonight during our dinner. You're welcome to join us out of uniform off duty, but not in uniform on duty. Well, they were so outraged that they sent fire trucks, and they did everything they could to shut down lights, sirens, more cops, everything they could to shut us down. So I saw just a tiny, 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 tiny speck of what the Native Americans saw, just a tiny speck. It's an outrage. It's an outrage at how they use their guns and their force against the Indians.
I've had similar experiences over the years, both San Francisco and in Texas. And what people don't realize, that there's a federal law passed in 1880 that says no reservation Indian is allowed to go into the state of Texas without first obtaining presidential authority to do so. Now, that's in the federal law. And my wife and I went to Dallas, Texas to do an arts and craft show. And after the show was over, we left, packed up, and started heading back home to Nevada. But it was after dark, and I was very tired, so I pulled over to the side of the road behind a large berm for peace and quiet. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, I was wakened up by sirens and flashing red lights, and I looked out the windows of my van, and we were surrounded by highway patrol of Texas. And a loudspeaker came on and announced, will the suspects in the vehicle please come out with their hands up? So, wow, this is kind of wild. Here we're just a couple of old people having a peaceful night's rest, and now we're surrounded by cops with sirens and loudspeakers. I opened the sliding door of our van, and I got out, and I had my pajamas on, my bottoms on, and I had to spread eagle and put my hands on the roof as these guys had their guns pointed at me. And I said, oh, damn, I'm in Texas in violation of federal law.
Oh, jeez.
They shook me down. They got my license and insurance, and everything was all right. And so they let me go. And I was just thankful that none of those officers were aware of the 1880 law that made it illegal for me to be in their beautiful state of Texas. But there I was. So I got back in the van, and I was wired up by that time, and I drove nonstop from through Texas on to Tucumcari, New Mexico, where I pulled over in a roadside rest, and I got some well-earned sleep. So that was one of the events that I experienced there, and I was in violation of that 1880 law. People don't know that.
It's an absolute
outrage. I have
outrage.
it in the law books right here in my library.
Mm-hmm. When you were in Alcatraz, can you tell me or tell us what happened? What caused the occupation? What caused you to say, okay, we need to get together get all the tribes together and go over to Alcatraz and occupy it.
It was not an instant event. Now, I'll have to walk you back in history to what happened.
Okay, we're going into a break, commercial break. It'll be a couple minutes, and then we're going to come back, and we're going to learn about Alcatraz, the occupation, and Dr. Adam Fortunate Eagle's role in that occupation, and we'll learn about the outcome. Very fascinating. I've been to Alcatraz, and it's because of Dr. Adam Fortunate Eagle's work. Class, we're talking about Alcatraz Island, and it's an island in the San Francisco Bay, about 1.25 miles offshore from San Francisco, California, in the United States. And it's a small island, and it has a lighthouse, a military fortification, a military prison in 1828. It was a military prison, and it was a federal prison from 1934 until 1963. And beginning in November 1969, the island was occupied for more than 19 months by Native Americans who were activists. And the principal organizer is our senior instructor, Dr. Adam Fortunate Eagle. So what happened?
Well, actually, I'm going to have to give you and your listeners a history lesson. Well, let's go back to 1933 when Hitler and the Nazi Party took control of Germany. And once they took control of Germany, they put out a mandate to all Jews in Germany to give a list of their possessions. Now, we know what happened later on. Now, we move forward to 1943, when World War II was going on full bore. The United States government put out a notice to all federally recognized tribes in America to list their assets: the uranium, the coal, the oil, the gas, timber, water, all other elements were that the tribe had in their possession was turned over to the United States, and that was called CERT, the C-E-R-T, the Council of Energy Resource Tribes. Now, the government had an inventory of all these assets of the tribe, and then in 1947, just a few years later, the government started to implement a proposal to terminate all reservations in America, and Zimmerman, a man named Zimmerman, was given the responsibility to write up a hit list for the sequence of tribes to be terminated. Then we go to 1953, when the government then implemented that Zimmerman report, and they call it the House Resolution 108, known as the Termination Policy, and that was to step-by-step abolish all reservations in America. And by 1969, the government had terminated 109 Indian reservations, rancherias, and bands of Indians. And my reservation at Red Lake was on the next round to be terminated. All of the reservations in Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and others were on the next hit list to be terminated. So once we occupied Alcatraz, the government stopped the termination policy. And on June 6, 1970, 8 months into the occupation, President Nixon officially repudiated the termination policy. Now, we won a major, major victory right there for our Indian people in stopping that dreaded termination policy, because if you look at what could have happened, if that termination policy had gone through as it was intended, there would be no Indian reservations today. There would be no federal recognition of the tribes. All treaties would be abrogated, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs would have been closed down. So that's what how Alcatraz becomes so important to our people is the fact that we stopped the termination policy, and by 1979, the government implemented something very radical. They gave the Indians self-government called the Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975. Now, that was another major plus of what we accomplished with that occupation, that peaceful occupation.
Okay, and let's. We're going into a commercial break again, and when we come back, let's talk about what it was like those 19-plus months that you and the rest of the American Indians, what it was like when you spent that 19 months on the island. We'll be right back. Dr. Adam Fortunate Eagle's with us, and we're talking about Alcatraz and the occupation. I remember hearing news report after news report going on for months and months and months, almost 2 years of, the Indians are still occupying, and it was never really said why and what the demands were. But please continue with what really happened.
Yes, okay. What really happened? Well,
yeah.
Actually, the occupation didn't just all of a sudden, like Normandy, hit the beaches. It started on November 9th when I arranged for boats to take us out to that island. Now, I had, before that happened, in order to maximize the publicity of this upcoming event, I met with news media people, Tim Finelli of the investigative reporter of the Chronicle, Reuters International, and all of those different people, news people at Tim Finley's Halloween party. And there I introduced Richard Oakes, the Mohawk from New York, and I introduced Richard as the man who would be leading the charge on Alcatraz. And this was 2 weeks before the actual occupation started, and so I had to inform the media. You can't give the advance warning to the government about what we intend to do, because if you do, there's going to be no story. We'll have to call it off. So on November 9th, I arranged for those 5 boats from Jerry's Bait Shop and Fillmore Street in San Francisco, but before we arrived that morning, somebody went down and chased off all 5 boats. Now, there I was with 100 Indians. I had the news media, we had TV, and everybody was there on Pier 39 in San Francisco, and we had no boat. So I handed the proclamation to Richard Oakes, to read to the media to keep them occupied, and I said, I got to go get a boat. And just a block away was a 2-masted schooner called the Monte Cristo, and Captain Craig was out in the front of it, and he looked like Errol Flynn, all dressed up in a swashbuckler type of outfit, and he was curious what was going on with all these crowds suddenly. So I told him, I said, we need to go to Alcatraz. And so he arranged, he said, okay, we can allow 50 people on board. And so, boy, there was a rush of Indians and media to get on that 2-masted schooner, and we left. I left the dock, and we circled the island, and on the north side of the island, Richards dove overboard and started swimming to the island, followed by 3 others, and unfortunately they didn't understand the tide, which was going out. And so Tim Finley and Reuters were fishing the Indians out of the island, out of the waters. But Joe Bill, the Eskimo, he was watching all of this from the boat, and we got to the east side of the island, he dove overboard, and the tide carried him right up to the island. And there was a big cheer on the boat from all the Indians there. We have an Indian has now landed on Alcatraz. And one small step. Oh, wait a minute. We're the wrong story there. So, anyway, we went back to the dock, and then I announced to the people I had the bullhorn, and are you through yet? They said no. So that evening, we went back to the temporary headquarters in San Francisco, and we started calling around and again called Jerry's Bait Shop, and I arranged for a boat to take us out to island that night on the New Vera 2. So we went down there that evening, and a bunch of us Indians got on board, and we went out to the island, and the New Vera 2 went up to the dock, and 14 Indians got over on the island, and the skipper panicked, and he reversed the engines and pulled away. But we had 14 Indians on the island. So that went on overnight. Of course, the media picked it up, and then the next morning the government was out there with their federal officials, and they talked to Richard Oakes and the 14 to leave the island. And so that was November 9th. But then we had a downtime until November 20th. And then, again, the plans were to take the island. And this time, instead of leaving out of San Francisco, we arranged with boat owners in Sausalito at the No Name Bar to provide transportation of Indians out to the island. And this time, we went out in force. 80 Indians landed on that island on November 20th, 1969. And then that's when we held the rock. We were not going to leave for the next 19 months. Now, life was tough. There's no question about it. But you know what was very important, because we used satire and humor, we were non-threatening to society around us. Then the Bay Area, the 11 million liberal people came out and supplied, they came out in force with all kinds of boats. They went against the Coast Guard blockade. The Coast Guard blockaded the island for 3 days, but the boat owners came from every direction like a swarm of bees and bringing food and supplies and water out to that island. And after 3 days, the Coast Guard gave up. And so it was the boat people of San Francisco that made that occupation possible, because without a quartermaster, we couldn't survive on that island. We had no natural resources. So the people of San Francisco, and then ultimately all different parts of the country, went out and supplied food and blankets and all kinds of things for the island. And even though I was the principal organizer, I didn't actually live on that island. I had a lot of issues to deal with at that time. I went around on radio, television, church groups, raising money for the occupation. But at the same time, I still had my business to run. I was the owner of my own termite company. I was also teaching at Cal State University at Hayward. I was chairman of the United Bay Area Council. I was the acting director of the Intertribal Council of California. So I had a full plate, and I was bouncing all around. But I kept going out to Alcatraz and meeting with Richard Oakes and bringing the news of what we were doing. So that went on for, well, of course, Richard, he lasted about 3 months on the island, and when his daughter Yvonne fell off down the stairwell and was killed, that ended Richard's regime on the island, and other Indians took over and continued the occupation for 19 months.
When you talk about the occupation, there were no cell phones back then, and so you just couldn't call and tell those on land what you needed and what the status was, and they couldn't communicate with you. Did you have two-way radios at all, or was it strictly person-to-person communication? It could be a boat trip.
Well, I was on radio talk shows like this all around San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, and also on making appearances on television, talking about the occupation and what it stands for and what was at stake about how we were up against the termination policy of 1953. So this is an important time in the history of America because nothing like this ever happened before in history. A peaceful occupation of an abandoned military and federal prison institution. See, the government, the public doesn't know that the government actually declared Alcatraz surplus property in 1968, the year before the occupation. And as chairman of the United Council, I saw a great opportunity right there. The government was handing me the brass ring of opportunity, so I started writing a 5-point proposal for the Indian use of Alcatraz Island, and that 5-point proposal ultimately changed into or morphed into the proclamation that we know of today. And
I understand that there's a treaty of Fort Laramie, 1868, between the United States government and Lakota that all abandoned or out of use federal land was to be returned to the native people who once occupied it, and that's what the Indians wanted to do. Is that right? They wanted it returned. Well,
that was not in my mind at that time because the Sioux Indians in the Bay Area tried to exercise that in 1964, just a year after the prison was abandoned as a prison. And so we went. The Indians of all tribes. We all have issues with the United States government. Every tribe in America has a grievance against the United States government for the treatment of our people by the government. So
we're going into a break. When we come back, would you like to share with us how difficult it was? And one of the takeaways is that a group of people actually faced down the United States government and won, and we can do it again. We'll be right back. Dr. Adam Fortunate Eagle is with us. What was it like? How difficult was it being on that island?
Well, it was tough, but then there was an overriding threat that hung over us all the time we were on that island. Even though the government had declared it surplus property in 1968, the government covertly was planning a military retaking of the island by force, if necessary. Two of the covert policies or federal military thing was Operation Pelican and Operation Park. The military in the bases around the Bay Area were rehearsing the military takeover of Alcatraz, and before D-Day was to occur, President Nixon called it off. No invasion of Alcatraz by military because he said, I don't want the blood of Indians on my hands. I don't want another Wounded Knee. So the military operation was called off, and as long as we held that island, we had a bargaining chip with the government, and the government then withdrew the surplus property policy of 1968, and once the Indians were removed in 1971, just 1 year later, the government made Alcatraz part of the national park system, thanks to the Indian occupation of Alcatraz. And the role that I played as the organizer, I was never given any credit for saving that island for the public, which now is one of the largest tourist attractions in San Francisco, bringing 1,500,000 people to that island each year. And the Indian occupation has been played down as to our role in saving that island for the public, for you and the rest of the people can go to that island now, thanks to the occupation. And my reward for that is the government declared me an enemy of the state, to be neutralized, to be discredited. I mean, this is another covert policy of the government called COINTELPRO. So COINTELPRO policy is what the government used to put me out of business. I ended by teaching at Cal State University. So my quartermaster was gone, and that's just the way the government wanted it. And so my wife and I then moved to her reservation here in Nevada. And we are in self-imposed exile, but we are forced out economically by the government. So I'm an enemy of the state, and one reporter asked a federal official, how long will I keep that title, enemy of the state? And the federal official said, until he's dead. So what the words we're talking about today are not good for the government, and how they want to depict themselves on the world stage as an honorable government. History has proven they are not honorable in dealing with Native people.
Can you share with us very quickly, we only have a couple minutes, the story about how some feds showed up at your residence on the reservation asking about you, asking your wife about you? Can you share that story?
Who showed up here?
Well, didn't the feds, the FBI, show up asking your wife if she knew who you were?
I'm a person of interest of different kind of crimes that were around here. And, I have occasional visitors from FBI, state police. There was a couple of years ago, somebody...
We only have about 30 seconds. Can you tell it quickly?
Well, my wife, while she was out in the front yard, and three officials showed up, and they showed a picture of me to her and said, do you know this man or where he is? And she said, no, he died a long time ago. And the three officials left. And so here I was sitting in the house all this time, not even aware of what's going on.
You married the right gal.
That's observation.
Yeah, you married the right gal. Dr. Adam Fortune Eagle, thank you so much for being with us today. That concludes our broadcast.